Can everybody hear me? I know I'm about 5 minutes early, but yay, I have people here. I'm still trying to figure out all this stuff. I can't begin to tell you how frustrating this has been. I've been taking a crash course in figuring out how to do this. So I've been taking a crash course on learning how to use OBS, and because I want to show my PowerPoints. It's been ridiculous. So thank you all for bearing with me. My first stream this morning was an unmitigated disaster because I hadn't figured everything out, and I feel awful. I can't say that enough. I feel absolutely awful. But hopefully this works. So we'll wait a few more minutes and see if anyone else comes in. Please throw some comments up in the chat. I'm going to experiment a little bit to make sure everything is working fine with OBS. Okay, can everybody see that? Hello, Twin Dad Gamer. There we go. Might block some stuff. This looks awful. Well, I want you to all be able to see my face while I'm talking too. So we'll see how this goes. I don't know how streamers do it. All right, get the phone out of the way. Okay, then. I totally screwed up on OBS this morning. Okay. Thank you all for coming here and watching my stream today. For those of you who don't know, my name is Nathan Marchand. I'm an author and a podcaster. You may have seen me if you've wandered around in the Author's Avenue at Gen Con in the Vendors Hall. I've been there selling books since, oh my gosh, how long has it been now? 2012, I think, was the first time I did it. So, and I've been there every year since. But in the last few years, I have actually become a podcaster. And it has been just as rewarding, I have to say, as being a fiction writer. Now, just to let you know, while I'm doing this presentation, I've got some slides here. I'm going to talk about the process of making a podcast, and I'm going to go through a lot of stuff. I'm going to try to get through it relatively quickly because I want to take questions from the chat. So the chat right now, you guys are the replacement for my audience. If I had been there giving this presentation at Gen Con, and I always like leaving some room for questions. If you have any issues with the stream, please let me know, and I will see what I can do to remedy that. It's been one heck of a day, I have to say. I have been so busy this week with other things, with the podcast and my new job and everything, that I haven't really had much time to have any fun with the online version of this convention. But without further ado, let's get on with So You Want to Be a Podcaster. So the first thing, let me switch back here. I'm a little surprised at how far behind this thing kind of is. All right. So hopefully my face in the corner isn't blocking everything. Are we doing good here? Yes. Okay. Thank God. All right. So, one of the great things about being a podcaster now is it's easier than ever. Podcasts have been around for, oh my gosh, over a decade now, I think. But the entry barrier to producing your own podcast is lower than it's ever been. And for those of us who are on a budget or don't necessarily have the biggest, fanciest audio equipment and such, that is tremendous. It's almost like self-publishing at this point, because there are so many places where you can do it, and there's so many avenues to get your stuff out there, and there's a lot of equipment and software out there that's free or relatively inexpensive that will make it that much easier for you. Like I said, there are more services, the cheaper equipment, and now, just like with a lot of writing, particularly independent authors like myself, you now have the option to do crowdfunding for these things, which is amazing, which we'll also get into. You can also get commercial deals. Yeah, I'm not kidding you. I haven't heard too many podcasts that have done this. I've heard a lot of podcasts that will have sponsors, so they'll have people who will pay them to have advertising. But you can also make commercial deals where, if you, kind of like with a lot of YouTube videos you'll see now, where they'll leave little gaps so that people can insert commercials for different products or services as sponsorship. And to be honest, podcasts are becoming more popular than ever. It's a lot like listening to music. Not only are they easier to hear, but a lot of times what people will do is they will listen to a podcast in their car instead of to their radio or to music, or they'll listen to podcasts while they're running. Pretty much anything that people have done in the past where they would be listening to music, they now use that time to listen to podcasts to educate themselves or to entertain themselves. So, you might be asking, how do I create one? Well, you came to the right place, my friends. Now, I'll go to the next, before we go to the next slide, I am going to check the chat here real quick, see if we have any comments. Plus, but like I said, feel free, please leave comments in the chat. I love interacting with my audiences. All right, I don't see anything right now, so we'll go to the next slide. So, creating a podcast. I'm going to kind of go through this in what was the order for me when I was making my podcast, because I do have my own podcast. I'll talk about that at the end of this presentation for a little bit. So this is kind of the process that I went through. And if you're a writer or really just a creative type in general, this will look familiar. Now, I'm not going to go over this whole list because there's a lot, but as you'll see here, the first thing you want to do is you want to select a genre of podcast. And what's nuts is only a few of these were ones that I made myself. I looked at a couple of articles in preparation for this presentation just to kind of see, well, what kinds of podcasts are there out there? And whoo boy, There's a lot. Podcasting is a very unique format in a lot of ways. It's almost like a throwback to old-time radio. And as you'll see here, there are a lot of different genres that you can try your hands at. Like I said, I'm not going to go over all of them, but there are a few here that I'll kind of run through this list and tell you about ones that I have personally listened to. I have listened to news and opinion podcasts. I've also done analysis and discussion, mostly because that is actually part of what my podcast does, although my podcast falls under several different genres. The interviews, I have a friend who I've listened to a few interview podcasts, including one that one of my podcast friends does. His is called The Kaiju Groupie, and what he does with that is he interviews people who are fans in the kaiju, not kaiju genre, but part of the kaiju fandom who are other podcasters or artists or something like that. He's even had me on his show. I've also heard one that I thought was actually really clever that was called Tea and Jeopardy. Unfortunately, I think that podcast is no longer up and running, but that one was interesting because it was also kind of part audio drama, because the shtick was it was an interview podcast where it was a writer interviewing other writers, and then some crazy fantastical thing would happen at the end of the podcast where the interviewee would get into some sort of trouble and then come up with some clever way to get out of trouble. So, like I said, you can do some cross-pollination here with genres. You can combine and cross them. And then another one that's really important that I've also seen is you have storytelling. And the storytelling podcast can show up in a couple different ways. One of the things that's wonderful about podcasts is that it's helping to, I don't know if revive is the right word, but they're bringing back the audio drama, which is really exciting. And then there are also ones that do storytelling through spoken word. They read excerpts from stories. I think LeVar Burton just started one like that where he reads short stories. There's also some where they read poetry. You may be familiar with a podcast called Welcome to Night Vale, which for me, it's storytelling, but it kind of blurs that line between audio drama and spoken word. I have a hard time figuring out where to put that. And then there are some really interesting ones on here you can find. There are personal journal podcast, which is interesting because I've heard about one. I forget the title of it right now, though. That is a guy reading his grandfather's letters from World War II. And I've heard a lot of good stuff about that one. I have Interview Cast on here twice. Whoops! Religious, there are churches that will take the audio versions of their pastor's sermons every week and put them up as podcasts. There's a lot of things. Obviously, I have to mention this since we are part of Gen Con Live. We have games and hobbies, and there are a lot of podcasts out there that are about games and hobbies, specifically video games and board games as well. All right. Let me check the chat again here really quick. Yes, that's what I was. Yeah, we've got some Welcome to Night Vale fans in there. I like it. There's nothing quite like listening to very old podcast archives that have had current ads stitched into them, cutting off content. Yeah. Yeah. LeVar Burton reads. That's true. Yep. LeVar Burton reads. All right. On to the next slide. So after you've selected a genre, you do then have to pick a premise or a concept. And this has to be something that makes your show unique, particularly when you're trying to dive into something that there's a lot of glut in it. There's a lot of stuff like that out there. There are people who are already doing a lot of things very similar to that. You'll need to pick a subject, and you need to pick a format. And formats are something that you can mess around a little bit. And that could entail having things like bumper music and theme songs, different segments. You also want to determine how many hosts that you want. And I recommend, and I did a little bit of research on this, and I found that this is usually how it works best. You usually want to have about 2 to 4 people on a podcast. That's optimum. If you go more than 4, it starts to get really chaotic. Trust me, I know. The second episode of my podcast, including myself, I had 5 people on the show. That was like herding cats. It's a lot of personalities to try to manage. And don't even get me started on the logistics and making sure that I had all the mics that I needed and those were all calibered and blah, blah, blah. There are solo podcasts out there, but doing a podcast solo is kind of hard. I've done solo episodes, although I will admit, if you listen to my show, I kind of cheat a little bit on that. It's part of one of the unique aspects of my podcast. But I do find, as I've heard some solo podcasts, and if you're going to do a podcast solo, you need to have a couple of things, one of which is a heck of a lot of charisma. And you have to have really compelling content. And I've heard podcasts, and if you can have both, more power to you. I've heard podcasts, solo podcasts that are able to survive on on at least one of those, but you really want to have both. The one that comes to mind as one where the host isn't necessarily the most charismatic, but the content is so fascinating and he presents it in such a fascinating way that it makes up for it, is the History of English podcast, which interestingly you think would be hosted by a linguist, but it's not. It's actually hosted by a lawyer who does all of this stuff, all this research on history and the English language for fun in his spare time. It's kind of amazing. The other thing you'll want to determine, not only do you want to make sure you have a co-host with you and that they're committed to making the show, you also want to consider getting guests. And I love having guests on my podcast. I love listening to podcasts where they bring on guests because it livens things up and adds new perspectives. You'll also want to consider what kind of content you want, which could be the things that you want to discuss, or if you're going to do a fiction or storytelling podcast, you'll want to make sure you have narratives figured out, at which point you'll just want to tap into your creative writer brain, which I will tell you, even though my podcast was meant to be more of a, spoiler warning, my podcast was originally supposed to be film analysis, but I couldn't turn off my creative writer brain, so a lot of creative writing things made their way in there. And then finally, when you're at this point in the process, be prepared to do a lot of planning, because you may have to do a lot of planning for it. You kind of have to schedule ahead. And, but it'll also depend on how set you want your schedule to be and how much stuff you want to have figured out before you start, or if you just want to wing it week in, week out. I've heard podcasts that do both and do both of them very well. All right, once again, I'm going to check the chat. Yes, thank you, Christine. Christine Sizemore, History of English is cool. Linguistic podcasts is one of my favorite genres. I should probably listen to a few more of those, Christine. If you have any recommendations for some linguistic podcasts, please let me know. Okay, next slide. So, creating a podcast. Here's the equipment, some equipment that you're going to need for this. And by the way, the picture that you see right here, that's my setup. Now, I don't have my laptop because I'll use my laptop for a lot of stuff. But this right here, minus my laptop, is the equipment that I use for my podcast. That's my soundboard, and that's my microphone. And, back there is the box for the microphone. It's not the most flattering picture in the world, but it gets the job done. So, you'll definitely want to have a computer with internet access because you need to be able to post your podcast online. Obviously, you're going to want a microphone. Now, you could do what I have here and actually buy a microphone, a professional-looking microphone. I will tell you, it is possible to get nice microphones that don't necessarily cost a whole lot of money, or you can do what I did and buy sound equipment when it goes on sale. If you want a quick recommendation, I probably should have included this somewhere in the presentation, but I'm from Fort Wayne, Indiana. And here in Fort Wayne, Indiana, we have a store called Sweetwater, which was originally made as a music store. People would buy musical instruments, and then you could get equipment to go along with that. But they have been a huge growing business the last few years, and they've branched out to start doing things like audio editing and recording, including podcasts, which is where all the equipment that you see in this picture, that's where I got it. I got it at Sweetwater, and every May they do what's called Mic Month, where they put all of their microphones 50% off. And I will tell you, I went in there and I snagged those things when they went on sale. So that's that microphone right there. I got that 50% off. And then a few months ago, I bought a second microphone to use for when I have guests, also 50% off. And all the accessories will be 50% off too. So the pop filters and the stands, which some other things that I mentioned right here. So a stand, the pop filter, that will help to make the recordings sound even better. Because I will tell you right now, I work really hard to, my first priority when I was making my podcast was to have really good content. Making it sound good was sort of secondary. But because I have such good equipment and I was able to kind of get lucky when I got it, I've been able to make the podcast sound really professional. I've been complimented for that. You're also going to want to have, obviously, recording and or editing software. Unfortunately, I kind of goofed up I didn't make these points right here. These were supposed to be sub-points under recording editing software, but, I was trying to get everything put together as quickly as I could. But the nice thing about this is, unlike video editing, because I've tried to be a YouTuber before, and video editing software is hard to come by unless you want to shell out some money for it. Audio editing, on the other hand, is a heck of a lot easier. Most of these audio editing programs that you see right here, they are free. Audacity, I believe GarageBand is, and Reaper. I know it for sure. Audacity and Reaper are free because I've used those. And right now I use Audacity for editing. And I have friends who use GarageBand. I have friends who use Adobe Premiere. I think that's what it's called. If I'm wrong, please let me know. But I think the Adobe audio editing program is called Premiere. Or is that the video editing program? I'll check the chat here in a second to see if I'm right or not. But please feel free to correct me. But I highly recommend Audacity. Audacity is incredibly user-friendly. And it has a lot of options. You can play around with a lot of stuff. And the user interface is not daunting. One of my problems with Adobe programs is that Photoshop and all the editing programs is that it's really confusing, and I don't know where everything is, and I'm afraid of screwing something up. You also, and this is something I thought about because I have styled my podcast after a radio show. If you want to have sound effects and music, I highly recommend music. I've heard a few podcasts that don't have music. It's a little less interesting. But if you have music in there, particularly if you have, I would say at the very least, you want to have a theme song to get people excited about the show and to close out the show. And you can also put in sound effects if you want to liven things up a little bit. You could also use the sound effects or the music as bumpers if you're going to go from one segment to the next. And I do highly recommend that you have headphones. These right here. These are gaming headphones, but I also use them to do phone calls on my computer for work, and I use these for podcasting. So they're pulling triple duty, which is wonderful. Now, I have here optional soundboard and then Skype video call software. And you'll see right here, that's a soundboard. And this is a soundboard. It's the Rodecaster Pro. It is specifically designed for podcasting. And I can't begin to tell you how much easier it has made my life. I absolutely love this thing. I got lucky when I was able to walk into Sweetwater and buy it when I could get it, when it was a new product and they were putting it on a payment plan so I could get it. And it has been a tremendous asset. It makes everything so much easier. I could do a whole presentation just on how to use that thing. And then if you're going to have guests who are, far away and you have the means, there's different ways to do it, but there are ways that you can actually record audio from video calls and use them in podcasts. I've heard plenty that do it. There are some shows where the co-hosts live in different cities or different states, and the only way they can talk to each other is through video calls. And in this quarantine that we're in, it comes in handy. All right, let me check the chat. Chat check. Adobe Audition, that's right. That's what I was trying to think of. Premiere is the video editing software. Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me see. Ryan Brooks, thank you so much for letting me know about that. And then John S., you threw that in there too. Good job. Oh, and Ryan Brooks there again. Okay. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So now we get to the nitty-gritty, the actual recording. The actual recording. Which, weirdly enough, I'm going to tell you right now, this may be a shocker. The recording, the actual recording might be the most fun part about being a podcaster, but it's not what's going to take up the most of your time. If you're like me and you do a lot of prep before every episode, you're going to spend a lot of time in, we'll call it pre-production. And then depending on how much editing that you want to do before you publish your episode, you'll spend a lot of time in post-production. The actual production part of the podcast will most likely be the shortest portion of it. Again, like I said, depending on how much prep you want to do beforehand and how much time you want to spend in the editing process. So some key pointers that I highly recommend you keep in mind when you're doing this is you need to set a schedule. Now, there are some podcasts where they're just like, well, put an episode up when we want to. Well, and you might be able to get away with that for a while or maybe after a while. But if you want to maintain your audience, you have to keep a set schedule. And it will also keep you on point to make sure that you're producing content at regular intervals. For example, my podcast comes out on the second and fourth Wednesdays of every month. And I have kept to that schedule since I launched it. Oh man, when was this? September, so almost a year ago. You also need to make sure you stay focused. Again, having a set schedule will... that actually, when I say stay focused, it's not just about scheduling. It's also when you're doing an episode, stay focused on your topic. I can't begin to tell you what... There have been several times where I've listened to a podcast episode and these people just meander and get off topic and it's boring and it's just not interesting and they lose my attention. And I have to work harder to keep up with what they're saying. And I mean, there are podcasts that can do that and do that well, but a lot of times it just doesn't work. You need to set your expectations. So you need to let your audience know this is what the show is about. This is what we're doing. Stuff like that. And I got a notification that scared the bejeebas out of me. Sorry about that. Should have turned my notifications off. But anyway, so you need to let your audience know very early on, maybe even in each episode, remind them this is what you're doing. Because like Stan Lee said about comic books, any episode that you produce could be someone's first episode. So you want to keep reminding them this is what we're doing. You can't just assume that they've been listening since the first episode. You also want to do your homework. If you are doing a podcast that's going to require research, which is what I do a lot of times since it's a film analysis podcast, you want to make sure you do work beforehand so you know what you're talking about. Or if you're a podcast that, say, analyzes an episode of a TV show every week, make sure you watch the episode so you know what you're talking about. So it could be something as simple as that. So you want to and while you're doing it, you want to make sure you create a sense of movement and momentum. Do that in every episode. Do that from episode to episode. So if you're doing a serialized audio drama podcast, you want to make sure that your story is moving along well. You want to make sure that if you're doing something that's nonfiction, that you keep it compelling and you maintain the movement throughout the episode. And a lot of that can come through a combination of things. It could be your personality. It could be the editing. There's a lot of things that can go into that. And you want to make sure you build a rapport with the listeners and with your other hosts and guests. I can't begin to tell you how far that will go. I've listened to a lot of podcasts where one of the biggest draws is that the hosts have amazing chemistry together, and it's really the glue that holds the episode together. And you also want to make sure you build a great rapport with your guests, because it will not only look good for you, it'll help your guests to feel at ease, and it will make the listening experience that much better. And you can also do it with your listeners if you do like what I like to do, which is invite listeners to send feedback to you and then share the feedback on the air. But the most important thing, what this all boils down to, is be fun, be interesting, and be compelling. I can't say that enough. That, more than anything else, is what will keep people coming back to your show. Okay, Ryan Brooks, I see. How do you source music if you're not very talented musically? What about music compression? I'll say, hold on to those questions until we get to the end. So, when you're publishing the podcast, I highly recommend that you create a website for your podcast. It'll be the easiest place where you can have this nice central hub for everything, preferably a paid one. So buy a domain. Don't do a free, like, podcastname.wordpress.com. None of that. Get an actual domain name. It'll look a heck of a lot better. And then you'll also want to get a podcast host, these are websites that will house the audio for your podcast and then send them out to different podcatchers. And here's a list of ones that I use or I've heard about or I have friends who use. Personally, I use Amazon S3, but there's also stuff like Podbean, Blueberry, SoundCloud, Red Circle, PowerPress. I technically use PowerPress, but not to host. I use it for other things, a whole bunch of them. And the nice part about this is that they are free or really inexpensive. Some of them will be a flat fee every month, like 10, 20 bucks. Some of them will be pay as you go, like Amazon S3. It's based on how much it gets downloaded. PowerPress is a plugin on WordPress that's great for that, which I have on my site, that helps me to set things up when I am distributing the audio from each post. And make sure when you're doing this, whether it's through PowerPress or any of these hosting sites, make sure that your podcast episodes are going out to as many platforms and podcatchers as possible. Apple Podcasts is the big one, but there's a lot of other ones like Stitcher and all that we'll get into here in a second. You want to make sure to get out to as many as possible so that as many people as possible will be able to hear them. And also, I highly recommend finding places to do analytics that will give you an idea of how many your episodes are being downloaded, how long people are listening, and stuff like that. There are some providers that do that automatically. That's part of the fee that you pay every month for the hosting. Other ones like S3 Stats, that's a separate website that tells you that gives you stats from Amazon S3. And just this week, I discovered another one called Chartable, and it's free. Again, I could spend a whole lot more time just talking about those. All right, it's time for that chat check. All right, no more comments right now. Oh, I mean, no, there aren't any new ones. Please keep commenting. Comment away. So, interestingly, you can get paid to do this. Yeah, yes, you can. You can. There are professional podcasts out there, media outlets like any of the TV news networks, NPR, people like that. They make podcasts and they get paid to do it. It's part of their job. If you're an independent podcast creator, as I assume most of you are, or could be, you actually have the option of going through crowdfunding to make it happen. Patreon's the big one. There are a lot of podcasters on Patreon, including me, I might add. So if any of you listen to my podcast and want to become a patron, please do. You can also go through Kickstarter or Indiegogo. Those are more for specific projects as opposed to ongoing monthly things. But if you have, I'm actually thinking about doing a Kickstarter for a big, sort of a, not seminal, milestone episode for my podcast. So I'm thinking about doing a small Kickstarter for that, just to make it a little bit easier on everyone involved and to get my listeners more involved with what's going on. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the challenges of podcasting. I've done a couple of different podcasts, including my current one, and these were some of the challenges that I've run into in my years as a podcaster. You're going to have a lot of competition because anybody and everybody is going to try to make their own podcast. There's a glut of them. But, as usual, the cream rises to the top. So make sure you're listening to what other people who are doing similar things to your show are doing so you can learn from them, try something different, or if they're doing something that you think is good, you can integrate it into your show. You also want to watch out for burnout. The interesting fact, this is a very interesting statistic. I found out that most podcasts don't last for more than 7 episodes. It's really sad. So think of it like that. If you can get to episode 7, well, rather I should say, if you can get past episode 7, you've outlasted a good chunk of podcasts. But also I would say, don't be afraid to take a break. So maybe you want to take a month off, a few months off, maybe treat it like a TV season. When the summer rolls around, you don't make new episodes, but let people know that's what you're doing. I've known podcasts that have taken hiatuses because they needed time to refresh themselves. It's hard to keep this up, week in, week out, or however often that you're posting episodes. I would also highly recommend finding out how to delegate tasks to avoid that burnout. Be willing to, you may have to wear multiple hats. I'm not only the host on my podcast, I'm also the editor, for one thing. And if you have if it's more than just you who's working on this podcast regularly, you got to make sure you delineate tasks. So it could be that one person edits and the other person manages the website and the social media, things like that. And this is something, I've had this happen. I've lost audio files. I've had audio files get corrupted. There have been times where I've been editing something on Audacity and something goofy happens and I have to monkey around with the audio because I'd already spent an hour or something editing and I didn't want to lose all of the changes that I had made. I've had issues with RSS feeds, although that doesn't seem to be nearly as much of a problem now. It was a couple of years ago. I haven't had any issues since I launched my new show. And this is weird. I've never done this, but I have heard a lot of stories about podcasters who've done this. They freaking forget to hit their own record button. So they will go through an entire episode for an hour or something, and nothing they said got recorded. That, my friend, is one of the greatest tragedies that can happen to a podcaster. And thank God I have dodged that bullet, at least for my own show. And then editing. Oh my gosh. Editing is one of the most necessary and important things in a podcast. But my gosh, it's the least fun part of the entire process. I don't like it. Well, I do and I don't. When I have to edit a podcast episode, I will get really single-minded about it, even though it's not fun. I generally don't have a good time doing the editing because it feels really tedious, particularly if you're working on a really long episode of the show. And also depending on how meticulous you want to be with your editing. Let me see. I'm going to check for some more comments. Yes, that's true. That's true, John. I've actually done that. He says that if it's non-newsworthy, you can get numerous episodes in the can. Yeah, I've done that. There have been times where I have recorded really far ahead with my podcast. Yeah, before you start releasing. I've even heard stories about podcasts who will record a whole season's worth of episodes. So, however many, 20. And then they'll drop them all on the same day and then let people binge listen to them. They use the Netflix model. I've never done that, not quite, but I can see why people would do that. All right, I'm going to the next slide. All right, so my conclusion, podcasting is amazing. It's a great creative outlet. which I can't be. I mean, I'm already a writer, but I love podcasting. When I started getting into it, I fell in love with it because there's so much that you can do, and even some of the limitations of podcasting. The fact that it's audio only, it encourages you to flex different creative muscles to figure out how you can make something interesting. And the other nice thing about it is quick, frequent feedback. Unlike, say, with a book, where you'll spend months on end working on a book, and then you get it published, and then maybe for a few weeks, a month, a few months, something like that, you might get people coming to you and say like, "Oh my gosh, I love your book. Oh, I just finished it." But then after that initial release, it's really going to trickle off. With podcasts, especially if you're putting them up regularly, the feedback will come really fast. And the people will just be coming to you all the time because you're always making new content on a regular basis. So they'll keep coming to you. So like, "Oh my gosh, I love your show. I love this episode. It's wonderful." You can make it yourself. So you can really make it your own, which is just great. Again, it's much like self-publishing. There's a lot of unique content out there because of that. And because it's such a different format, it really is, it's weirdly old-fashioned in a way, because radio used to be how television is now, or how the internet is now. That was the center of entertainment in a home, and news and everything else. And now a lot of that stuff is coming back thanks to podcasting. So you can find some really cool things. You may have heard the term ASMR. That's a thing with podcasts. There's a lot of storytelling ones. There's some that are offering unique perspectives on different subjects. So there's so much that you can learn through these podcasts if you know the right places to go to. And honestly, it's just fun. I can't say that enough. It is incredibly fun. I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing with this podcast if it wasn't fun. Yes, I want to inform people, and I want to open people's eyes to a genre of film, or multiple kinds of films that people just don't take seriously. I want to offer different perspectives on it, but I also want to entertain people. In fact, I'll get into it right now. My podcast is the Monster Island Film Vault, and the tagline for my podcast is I'm forgetting it already. The caffeine's wearing off. It is seeking entertainment and enlightenment through tokusatsu, which is Japanese special effects filmmaking, just so you know, if you don't know what tokusatsu means. And that's what I strive to do with every episode. I want it to be entertaining, and I want it to be informative. And from the feedback that I have been getting from people, I genuinely think I have succeeded in doing that. All right. So this is my last slide. We have about 10 minutes here. I'll start fielding questions. So give me a second to look through the chat. And if you have any questions you haven't asked yet, please feel free to throw them at me. But let me backtrack here a little bit. Oh, Tyrell Harness, you're from Indiana? Haven't lived there for at least 10 years, but it's still home. Yes, it is, my friend. Born and raised Hoosier boy, right here. Let me see. History of pie. Okay, so Ryan Brooks. How do you source music if you're not very talented musically? Let me field this one first, because he asked this a few minutes ago. I'm assuming what you mean is, where do you get music for your podcast if you're not a musician yourself? Well, I can tell you what I have heard other podcasters do and what I myself have done. I've heard of other podcasters who have actually talked to some of their musician friends and had them make music, original music for the podcast. I have, in the past, for a previous podcast, actually went onto Fiverr and hired a guy to produce a theme song for the podcast. So it's all original music. But what I do now, and what a lot of my friends do, is they use public domain music so they don't have to worry about paying royalties. My go-to source actually is the ocremix.org, which is a website dedicated to video game music remixes. In fact, if you listen to my show, the theme song is actually a remix of a song from Shadow of the Colossus, which I thought was very appropriate given that I talk about giant monster movies. And if you play Shadow of the Colossus, it's about giant monsters. So those would be the places I would recommend you do. Talk to your musician friends and look for public domain music. What about audio compression? Are you talking about when you're putting the episodes together and, and all of that? I'm not 100% sure what you're talking about. I haven't had any issues with audio compression. What I do is after I finish editing it in Audacity, I export it as an MP3. And so that seems to work out very well for me. I haven't had too many problems with audio compression because everything seems to sound really nice. Any tips on doing interviews, collabs, both in person and remotely? From Tyrell Harness. I'll be as cordial as possible. And if you're talking about interviews, I would at the very least make sure that you've done your homework on who you're interviewing, have prepared questions if need be, but also be open to asking questions on the fly. In fact, my latest episode of the Monster Island Film Vault is an interview with a guy who just published a book. And if you listen to that, I came up with all of my questions pretty much on the fly. I mean, I had a few in mind, but I wanted to make it a little bit more conversational so I could just throw stuff at him on the fly. And for collaborations, again, do your homework. I also highly recommend if there's some people out there in the in a fandom community, make friends with them because that will make them more interested in coming on the show. And I would also recommend trying to tailor the episode toward the guests. So in my case, I have guests on the show all the time. And so if I know, I plan out what movie I'm going to be discussing. And then I think about who I think would be the most interesting person to show this movie to or to discuss this movie with. And then, like I said, I try to tailor it toward them. You make it about the guests and not about you. Let me see. Do you use voice compression on your, do you use audio compression on your voice during production? One of the nice things about my soundboard is that it will auto level the audio. So I don't have to do anything with it. So all you have to do is just adjust the settings on the soundboard, and that takes care of it. Audacity also does offer the means to change the levels around with when you're editing as well. I'm assuming I'm understanding that question correctly. If I'm not, please let me know. Necessary equipment or programs or suggested microphones for interviews from Tyrell Harness. I use a Rode microphone, and that's my primary one. I forget what brand my second microphone is. I don't have it anywhere around here, but those are the ones that I use. Let me see. Oh, okay, Josh Davis. Audio compression is the bitrate for the MP3s. I actually honestly don't mess with that a whole lot because the default settings on Audacity seem to work really well because my audio sounds really nice. So I haven't had to mess with that a whole lot. From your experience, do people seem more likely to subscribe to a 30-minute episode podcast or a 60-minute episode podcast? From Alex Paul. That's a little hard for me to answer because the lengths of my episodes tend to go a little all over the place. I've had some as long as 2.5 hours. My shortest one, honestly, was actually my first episode where I was just laying the groundwork for what the show would be. It's only 15 minutes, but I also have done a lot of episodes that are only about 30 minutes long. And I've listened to other podcasts where they've had episodes that range from 30 minutes to 3 hours. I've made a 3-hour podcast episode, not for my current show, but for a previous one. So it's really kind of all over the place. It depends on who your audience is and what their expectations are. I've found that if you make your content compelling, that people aren't going to worry as much about the length of it. I mean, one of the most ridiculous podcasts in terms of length that I've ever heard was Hardcore History. Now, mind you, that guy only puts an episode out every couple of months, but when he does, they're 4 or 5 hours long, and people love that show. So, it's hard to tell. It really is. That's one of those times where you probably want to do research on your audience to find out what it is that they want. Oh, John S. I mean dynamic compression, not data compression. Okay. The I'm guessing my microphones might take care of that. I'm not sure. Okay, Tyrell Highness for context. I'm a zookeeper and have worked with several facilities. Kelso have family in the industry, so I'm making a behind the zoo podcast. Look behind the curtain on what it takes to run a zoo. In that case, Tyrell, the I would say probably keeping your episodes in that sweet spot of about 30 to 60 minutes might be what you want to go for. I think that's about the average for most podcasts. What about collaborating with a co-host over long distance? I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that. I've done it. I've done it, and there are challenges with that. But there's a lot of stuff that I could go into about that. I would need some more specific things that you want to know. I'm the day, in the days of physical distancing. Yeah. What online chat do you use? I primarily use Skype. It's the easiest one for me to use with my soundboard because my soundboard actually has a Bluetooth feature. So I will contact somebody over Skype on my phone, and then that audio will get Bluetoothed onto my soundboard and then put into the recording. I have used Discord, but not to record. Not me anyway. I've experimented with Discord with my soundboard and it doesn't work out very well. However, I do have audio recordings from some Discord conversations that I've done either by guesting on another podcast or as part of these big collaborative projects that I've done with other podcasters. Just waiting for some more comments to come in. I hope I got everybody's questions. I'm gonna sit here and vamp, waiting for those questions to come in. You know what? While I'm waiting for some more messages, I will throw my podcast website at you guys. I'll also put in my author website. So if you're readers and you want to check out my books, you could also find me on the Looking Glass website on gencon.com. You can find my stuff there. Hold on a second. I saw something pop up, but let me get the website first. The Podcasto website. There you go. Let me see. So Skype gives you good enough quality? For the most part. I've had some issues where it drops a call or something like that, but generally speaking, it works out pretty well. Any good resources for learning how to set up your podcasting setup? I've seen a lot of articles online that show you how to do it. There are how-to videos out there about to do it. And interestingly, there are podcasts on how to podcast. For me personally, a lot of it just came from being in the thick of things. I would do a little bit of reading. I did some reading on how to do it, but it really, ultimately, I just had to get into the field and figure it out myself. A lot of trial and error. Be prepared to go through some growing pains. Turn in their tickets? How do you turn in tickets for this? I'm so confused. I probably should have paid a little bit more attention to what's going on. Best advice for someone completely new starting from the ground up. On podcasting, make really, really good content. That's the most important thing. Good content will cover up a multitude of sins, my friend. Have you done any live shows? I've done a few. None that I have published on my podcast feed, but I have done some. Ryan Brooks, if you could go back in time and give one piece of advice to yourself at the start, what would you say? Collaborate with the right people. I have collaborated with some people in the podcasting world that didn't end well. So that would probably be, honestly, be the biggest thing I would tell myself. And I'll take one more question because we're already 10 minutes before the hour. And if anybody here needs to leave to go to their next online event, please feel free to do so. Oh, you know what? If anybody here needs to leave to go to their next event, feel free. I'll keep live streaming and taking some questions for a little bit longer. How about that? We get some bonus time with the March Hand. So what about taking listener calls? I have not done that yet. Aside from having co-hosts or guests call in for Skype. But it is something that you can do. One of the cool things about my soundboard is that if someone sends me audio feedback, I can download that soundbite and then load it onto the soundboard and play it live during a recording at the press of a button. So there are ways to do it. Give ticket to host button. Okay, so I don't have to worry about anything. Thanks, Ryan, because I was a little scared. Like, did I forget to do something? Okay, JT Olson. Now you're just getting nerdtastic with this. Ultraman versus Godzilla. Who would win? I don't know. Don't make me choose because I love them both. I really do. I can't pick. Although, well, here. Well, actually, if you want to get technical about it, Ultraman and Godzilla kind of did fight each other because they recycled a Godzilla suit for one of the monsters of the week on the original Ultraman. All they did was paint it green and put a frill on it, and Ultraman killed him. So if you want to cite that as evidence, go ahead. But otherwise, I would say real Ultraman, real Godzilla. I can't decide. Okay, let me see. Okay. Thanks, Tyrell. John S., can you give a link to your soundboard? Yes, I will. I will jump onto the Sweetwater website and send you the product listing for it. I don't know if there's anywhere else where you can buy it. And actually, if you Google it, it's the first thing that will come up. Well, that and the actual product. The actual product website from Rode Microphones. That'll come up too. But give me a second here. And the cool thing is Sweetwater sells the soundboard for, I think, about 30% under suggested retail price. So that comes in handy. And let's see. So that's the product listing. And then I have this. Then here, oh no, it doesn't want to work. Oh, the product listing is too long. There's the website for the product itself. I would just recommend you do a Google search for Rodecaster Pro and you'll find it on Sweetwater. I'll at least send you the Sweetwater website, and then you can do a product search. But the URL for the actual listing is too long to put into the chat. Okay. Here you go. How much money can you actually make doing a podcast? Well, like that, there's a lot of factors for that. Depends on, if you have a bunch of patrons and how many patrons you have, if you want to do it professionally. Don't expect to make a lot of money at the start. It's something that you're going to have to build over time. But, full disclosure, if you go to my podcast Patreon site, which I'll share a link to that as well, I'm making about $30 a month currently because I have a handful of patrons. I'm hoping to grow that and make more money, but that's where I'm sitting at the moment. Give me a second here. But I also know of other Patreon creators that make more money than that. Some of them, like there are some YouTubers out there that make, or streamers, even video game streamers, who make enough money through Patreon or whatever source that they use that they actually make a living off of it. I'm not quite there yet. I often hear podcasters joke about rolling in money on their shows. Yeah, it's a joke. Definitely a joke. Very much a joke. All right. I'll stick around for a few more minutes. We've still got some viewers here. Do we have any more questions? Come on. Come on. Throw them at me. I love it. Come on. Some more. Give me more. All right. While I'm waiting for those to come in, I'll send you my author website because I totally screwed up this morning with my first stream. I'm going to make up for that. I'm going to redo that stream and start sharing that with people because y'all deserve better. Yes, I just said y'all. You're welcome, Ryan. You're welcome. Yes, John. Yeah, I follow several YouTubers that make a living at what they do, usually through Patreon or some other crowdfunding website and whatnot. Some streamers I know just they do live streams on Twitch and people just donate money, just literally just like make it rain. They just throw it at them. It's kind of nuts. What about rebroadcasting content from other people but in other languages and regions? From Augustin Garzino. My first question about that would be making sure that you have permission to do that because copyright law comes into effect and it might get even hairier depending on the source of the country where it's coming from. But I would say if you have permission to do so, you can do it. Although, if you're broadcasting it to an audience that doesn't speak that language, that could be problematic because you'll have a language barrier to deal with. And when you're talking about audio, you can't just put subtitles up. Worst product or software to use? I would say not necessarily that it's a terrible product, but and there are some shows that do this and they get away with it, but I don't recommend either getting a really cheap microphone or just talking into your phone. I've heard podcasts that do that and they make up for it through other means like really great content or a really compelling host like Earth Destruction Directive by Luke Giaconetti is an example of that. He records into his phone, but he's such a good host and has such good content that I get over the fact that he's doing that. And the watch out for editing software that you have to pay for, especially early on if you're not making money at this. And I also make sure that you are very selective about who you have as your host for your episodes. Don't let them take advantage of you like that, and make sure that the sites that they're using are very secure so that your content doesn't get stolen. How many shows have you done that you didn't release? Are you talking about how many episodes have I recorded that I haven't released, like I just never did it? Not very many. However, there's been a lot. I've cut a lot of content from my recordings that I didn't share for various reasons. A lot of times it was shop talk. A lot of it was some personal conversations that were in the middle of the recordings. But there hasn't really been an episode that I just plain haven't released yet. Unless it's waiting to be released. I usually have episodes in the docket waiting to be released. John S. says, how many hours a week should I expect to work on day a 1 hour weekly show? Honestly, it really depends, John, on how much time you want to put into it. I have known podcasters that were very meticulous with the work that they did and they would slave over it. I've also known podcasters who would do less work and just throw it out there for everyone to hear. So it really depends. I don't have a hard and fast rule for you. I can tell you that I do invest a lot of time with each episode that I produce, which is why I only put out 2 episodes a month usually. And the way I have it set up is that I'll do one longer episode at the beginning of the month and then a shorter episode. You know, when I say longer, I mean like generally speaking about 90 to 120 minutes. And then the second episode of the month, I try to shoot for about a half an hour just to make it easier on myself. All right. You're welcome, Tyrell. I'm not worried about your typos, man. Yeah, I've worked as an English teacher before, but you know, this is the internet. I'm very forgiving, so don't worry. So, unless there are any more questions, I'll wait another minute or so. If there are any more questions, please send them in. Otherwise, I think I'm going to close things down. I've got some stuff to do in about an hour, and I know a lot of you have other events that you need to get to. Thank you so much for coming. It was wonderful talking with you and doing this presentation. And thank God I have a better idea how to do this now. And like I said, subscribe to my podcast, give it a listen, send me feedback. I love reading feedback from listeners on the show. I will warn you, be prepared. Like I said, there's some fiction elements in that podcast. So the Nathan you hear on the show is a character. You know, it's a fictionalized version of myself. It's really just me cranked to 11. So, you know, just to let you know. But again, thanks so much. Have a wonderful day. Have a great con. I'll see you later.